Good morning, welcome, friends and family. I just want to thank everyone for coming today to celebrate a man who's lived 91 years, a very long life, a very good life, and he's surrounded by some great friends and families like your folks for here today. Thanks for all for being here. I'm going to talk about my father's life when he was a child and when he was a young man, and I'm going to give it over to Gary afterwards to talk about when he had children and his life with Dorothy. And so let me start out. Before I talk about Alfred, it's important to really understand the time period he lived in. He was born in February of 1932, and which is the height of the Great Depression. And it's hard to understand that for the young folks here, that it was a very dark period. The stock market crashed in 1929, 3 years afterwards. 1932 was a very low point. And after talking to some of my dad's really close friends, Sam Dorduck and Mike Emanuel, 30 years ago, they painted a very bleak period at that time period. Bread lines, soup kitchens, people were out of work, unemployment rate was 22%. A really tough period to live in from 1930s, 1940s. But the one thing they talked about that was really important was the sense of how you got along with your neighbors so much, and how you relied on your neighborhood, your neighbors or your extended family, and how important that was for how close you were. You needed each other, and that's a little different than today. It's not the same thing. So that's phrased at that point, the time period when he was there. Alfred was, I said, born in 1932. His mother was Irma Larsson. She was an immigrant. I came from Gothenburg, Sweden, in 1912 with her 4 brothers and her sister, and she came to Ellis Island, and that was the same year of the Titanic had sank, to give you the time period. My grandfather was a first generation born in Germany. He was born in America in 1894, Alfred Klinzmann, and my great grandfather he came to the United States in 1870s. So to give you a sense of what that was. And my father had one sibling, his sister Faye, who was 2 years younger than him, and unfortunately she passed away 2 years ago. And so that's their family. I'll give you a sense of what it was. So Alfred always talked about growing up, and the things he talked about was when he was a child, going to Mary Abbott School, elementary school in Waterbury. I mean, he talked about it at length, and anyone who knows him, I see Nancy chuckling right now, but she knows what I'm talking about. And the one thing about my dad was he had an amazing memory. Anyone who knows my dad well will say this. He would talk about his time at Mary Abbott. He knew every teacher. He knew every person in that class and where they sat, and by grade. He could tell you that to the day he passed away. It was amazing. Like, me and Gary always laughed, but his memory was a superpower. The guy was just laser pointed. He could tell you everything about what's ever happened in his life. It's incredible. When he went to high school, he went to Leavenworth High School in Waterbury. He went to school to be a tool and die maker. But when he was in high school, he did something else. He had a newspaper route for the Waterbury American Republican. And it wasn't just your typical paper route. He made it a business, in high school. And he had over 200 papers to deliver before he went to school. And then he delivered 200 more papers after school. And he also had a Sunday route. So the man was a go-getter. He was driven. He had a lot of energy. And he instilled that into me, Gary, and Lori. We're young kids. You got to work. Me and Gary had paper routes when we were 8 years old. And we had it all the way through high school. And he started that with us. So there's something he always did. And by the time he was 20 years old in 1952, he got drafted into the U.S. Army for the Korean War. And my dad talked a lot about the time that he was over in Korea, for our country. He was stationed over in Busan, Korea. He was ranked he was a corporal, and he was in the 765th Transportation and Railway Battalion. That's where he was at. And he was working on all the steam locomotives, fixing them, maintaining them so that all the supplies can go to the front lines. And you know, he talks a lot about that. There's a lot of pictures outside when, you know, in his time in Korea, and you know, he did his country proud, and I really thank him for his service, because that was a very challenging war. But I'll tell you a funny story. He always talked about it. When he was over in Korea, there was one day the Marilyn Monroe came to Korea, and there was, in 4 days she saw 100,000 troops, but they came over there, and he always talked about how she came there and lifted the spirits of the GIs in that time period, and he just, you know, always talked about like what a you know, a mood changer that was for the troops, and just something he did that was pretty unique in 1954. He was honorably discharged in August of 1954, came home, went to Waterbury, and he worked at Scoville's. Scoville's is the largest manufacturer in Waterbury. And back in 1954, it was like, you know, Waterbury was the brass capital of the world, right? It was thriving metropolis. That city was bustling. And he worked there as a tool and die maker with my grandfather and my uncle Franklin. He was his manager. And the three of them were tool and die makers, had a lot of pride. They worked there. My dad worked there for 30 years, you know, loyal employee. He was there at 4 in the morning every day, never called in sick, had, you know, amazing work ethic. And, you know, he just was a perfectionist. I brought a couple things my dad made. He was at Scoville's and Century Brass. I know these seem like pretty simplistic, but these are ice cream scoops that he made. And, you know, they're made in the USA. He was very proud of those. These are Hamilton Beach. You probably have some in your house right now. But he loved it, and we used them, and this thing will probably last 300 years. These things are, you know, bulletproof. Pretty amazing. But he was very proud of it. Also, aside from working, my dad had a passion. He was a really good mechanic, and he and his friend Tony, and visiting Basil, I was hoping they'd be here today, but they were his best friends. And along with my grandfather, they had a stock car they built together, and that stock car they would race. It was called it was a number 77 car. I have it on the board out there. Called the polka dot bikini, and they had a little curl of the bikini on the side of the car. A little risque for the day, but you know, that was that's what you did, right? So Tony Basil was the driver. My dad was the mechanic. They would race down in Savannah Rock in the mid 50s in 1962, and they loved it. Tony would race it, bang it up. They win the races. He was a very aggressive driver. They tow the car back home, fix it over the weekend, do it again next week, and bang it up. And you know, they had a love for it. My grandfather was involved too, and he was, you know, obviously heavily. You know, they changed the rims, they changed the gear ratio, the axles. They just had a passion for it. You know, they were doing it every day, and you know, they won a lot of races. But I think more importantly, it forged their really tight bonds. Tony and Vinny were like, and to me, the stories I heard from my father. These guys are like legends to me and my brother. These guys, the stories they did, amazing. I wish they were here today, because I'd give them a hug, because they were just amazing. And they did so much together. Outside of that, my dad had another passion. Most people wouldn't know this, but he was a ballroom dancer. And he took all these lessons, you know, the rumba, the foxtrot, the merengue, the cha-cha, and you know, he was really good at it, right? That man could just glide across the dance floor, with just smooth as silk, right? And I can remember with Gary, and this is gonna make me laugh, but he would come to us, and we were 8 years old, and he tried to teach me and Gary how to do the foxtrot. I can still hear his voice. Slow, slow, quick, quick, and he'd do the move, right? Right? You know what I'm talking about. He would do this all the time. And me and Gary would have none of it, right? We were like, no, Dad, this is 1978. We don't do the foxtrot. We do the hustle. So, you know what I'm talking about. So, you know, it was pretty funny. But Alfred got the last laugh, though. Not gonna lie to you. He was, you know, for me and Gary's wedding, we both learned the foxtrot for our first dance. And we took lessons. I think I took like 15 lessons for it. It was very involved. I really had appreciation for what he did. So he got the last laugh. We both did a foxtrot for our first dance, and he was right. I should have done the fox. I learned that when I was 8 years old. But he also told me a story, and Gary, that when he was, it was like 1959. He went up to the Berkshires up in northern Massachusetts, and he went up there and he found a partner to do some dancing. There was 400 contestants in this dance competition, and this woman he trained to learn the cha-cha in literally 2 hours. And he was a very good teacher, and they learned and ended up winning the whole competition. Like, that was a pretty big deal. Like, he was pretty proud of that fact. He was able to pull that together. But it just shows how Alfred was such a great teacher, and he just was able to do that. And I know, like, he was always him and Dorothy always danced, even when they met her in 1979. Every Saturday night they were going out dancing, and they just loved to do that. It's just a part of their life. And lastly, I just want to mention, it has to be said, because my dad loved to fix things. He was just the most amazing mechanic, right? He could fix lawnmowers, tractors, snow blowers, wash machines. If it was mechanical and it could be fixed, he did. If he couldn't find the part, well, we had a tool shop in our basement. He just took a piece of bar stock and made it. I saw him do it, complete amazement. But going back to his sense of community, when he was a kid, he always helped his neighbors out. He lived in Waterbury, Southington, Wolcott, and East Hampton. And everyone knew Al. Like, his neighbors all knew him, and they counted on him. Like, he was like, oh, my tractor's broken. Hey, my water pump's not working. Who'd they go to? They went to Al. Like, he never charged people. He was there as a crackerjack. The guy could just fix anything. And I think he just always helped his neighbors. That's what he learned as a young boy, and something he carried on his whole life. He really was impressive. I just want to say, I learned so much from you, Dad. You taught me, Gary and Lori, so many valuable lessons. You lived true. I don't think I ever heard you ever lie. You were just a good person overall, and gonna miss you dearly, Dad. You're the best. I love you so much. Thank you.